Ave Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex qua mundo lux extorta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes.
Good morning again. My job in this session is to introduce the introducer of Joseph Bottum. Peter Flanagan is a former special assistant to President Nixon, a longtime partner at Dillon Reed, an inner-city philanthropist and founder of student-sponsored partners. To us at Portsmouth, he's part of a three-generation, and we're hoping for several more generations, family. In fact, the patriarch of that family. An alumnus of the class of 1941, possibly the greatest class in the school's history, and a great friend of Bill Buckley's, and a wonderful member of the greatest generation. Peter.
Thank you, Jamie. That introducer of the introducer reminds me of that comment, I danced with a man who danced with a girl who danced with the Prince of Wales. It seems to me entirely fitting that we're gathered here on the shores of Narragansett Bay, the Mecca of U.S. sailing, and at Portsmouth Abbey, the center of Catholic learning, to celebrate the life of Bill Buckley. I spent more time with Bill at sea than I did on the land. I was never on one of his ocean crossings in large boats. The book of one of those crossings is there on the shelf. But we did sail together on small boats, his and mine, from the Bahamas to Newfoundland. And those cruises went from 3 weeks to an overnight escape. You might have read that book and know something about those crossings, but what doesn't generally come through in the books is his carefree, almost devil-may-care approach to skippering a boat. With the written word, or with a good idea, Bill was careful and precise. But with a boat, it was diametrically the opposite. No matter what the weather, he'd set sail. No matter the crisis, he was having fun. He never saw a dock that he didn't want to charge. He thought at exactly the right moment he'd throw it into reverse, but he miscalculated, and there was this frightful thump. He scorned a GPS or a Loran. Those are technical electronic navigation systems, and he opted for celestial navigation with his sextant. And so, after taking a star sight and doing complicated mathematical equations, he'd declare delightedly that we were, oops, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Thank God for technology. Well, all this, of course, was the ever entertaining and amusing Buckley. Serious things were treated seriously. And religion for Bill was the most serious of all. You all know that he publicly proclaimed his belief in Catholic faith in his books and in his articles. I recall a very long article in the New Yorker, of all places, which was on the typical day of Bill Buckley. And he relates how after a hectic schedule, he falls into the bed, and he says, "As I have since childhood said a rosary." Now imagine praying a rosary to Our Lady in the pages of the New Yorker. He was an extraordinary public witness. Near the end, when the time for lighthearted, less important things had passed, Bill's faith became ever more central. Always the conservative, as you heard from Father Rutler yesterday, he greatly preferred the Latin Mass and had a priest friend who'd been a staffer at National Review celebrate a Latin Mass for him on Saturday evenings. When his emphysema had become so bad that every step was an enormous effort, and when his friends urged him to stay home, he insisted on attending that Mass. I recall a Saturday just before he died, when he slowly, painfully struggled up the few steps to the chapel, and throughout the service his labored breathing accompanied the Latin prayers. I almost wondered at the time he died if the church in New York at least could survive the loss of Bill Buckley, Avery Dulles, and Father Newhouse. All three were men of towering Catholic thoughts, and they were writers, two of them having founded magazines that then and still today challenged the conventional thinking. Bill with the National Review in the sphere of political philosophy and practice, and Father Newhouse with First Things in the sphere of religion, culture, and public life. It was reasonable for those of us who had relied so heavily on these publications to wonder whether they would, without Buckley and without Newhouse, continue to lead in the battle of ideas. Regarding First Things, the first issue after Richard Newhouse's death was an extraordinary paean of praise for him from a large number of intellectual leaders who loved him. It was a brilliant special edition. The current June-July edition, however, is in the traditional First Things format. It's excellent, every bit as good as its forebearers. The Public Square section, if you know the magazine, which Father Newhouse had always written, which is in the back of the book, but which is always read first, was as incisive and as informative as ever. This time, it was written by the editor. That success, of course, is entirely due to its editor, Joseph Bottum, known to his friends as Jody. Jody Bottum comes from South Dakota, where citizens are known for strong character and solid good sense. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and has a doctorate in philosophy from Boston College. After several years as the literary editor of the Weekly Standard, he came in 2005 to First Things as its editor. He also writes books, poems, essays, reviews, and what have you. Jody lives in New York with his daughter and wife. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with the greatest of pleasure that I give you the editor of First Things, Joseph Bottum.
Solid good sense. One recollects that South Dakota was the state of George McGovern, after all. In the context of honoring William F. Buckley, I don't think that's a name that resonates with much sense. I sat down and I thought I would speak about William F. Buckley as a writer originally, and I began to analyze his sentence structure and that peculiar way in which, I don't know if you've noticed this, temporal elements in his sentences would always drift toward the front of the sentences. And I was going to work all this out, and I thought it's not quite right to try and understand the man. And I wanted to think about his Catholicism and where it showed up. But in order to get there and to understand that first book and what it mattered, I think you need a picture of him in mind. In photographs from those days, the young William F. Buckley of the 1950s, if you look at them, he always seemed to have his legs stretched out. His feet were always up on a nearby chair, or they were up on a pile of books or on an open desk drawer. Slumped down, the phone squeezed to his ear by his shoulder, his fingers twiddling a pencil, he looked both involved and yet distant, caught up in the moment and a little bit removed, self-absorbed and self-ironic, a 30-year-old man with a fairly clear idea of what his talent was worth. He always seemed to be doing what he did and something more besides at the same time. Perhaps that strange sense of always being more, of always doing more, is the key for understanding the man. When he died last year, obituary after obituary spoke of the tools he had used to create the modern conservative movement. His compelling voice, his eloquent speeches, his good looks, his family wealth. As it happens, his voice wasn't really resonant. He talked through his teeth too much. The words all formed in the front of his mouth and pushed out as if by an act of will. For that matter, he wasn't classically eloquent. He often phrased things, particularly in his writing, but in his speeches as well, to draw attention to the way that he phrased them. And from the beginning of his career to the end, he fancied long words solely for the sake of his fancy. The money was real enough. In 1955, his father could afford him to give $100,000, which is about $750,000 in today's money, to help start National Review. But even there, the family money was less than a truly great fortune. The Buckleys were not the Rockefellers. They were just, in those days, rich people who had passed beyond the need to work for their bread, and the money mostly existed in William F. Buckley's life as yet another instrument by which he lived always in some way more. What he did, in effect, was roll together his odd elocution, his elaborate vocabulary, his interesting looks, and his Catholic background to create one of the great acts on the 20th century American public stage. Look, for instance, at the photographs and film clips of the 1965 race for mayor of New York. About the only term I can use to describe it is improvisational theater. This was a campaign he entered when, as he later put it, the Conservative Party offered him the nomination, and he said, "I looked at it and thought, what the hell, this is kind of interesting." During the race, he proved wittier and more fascinating, more of a genuine figure than anyone in New York City politics since LaGuardia. And he seemed to fill the room during the campaign's televised debates, larger, cleverer, and sharper than his opponents could ever be. Oh, he was defeated without much difficulty. The New York audience didn't actually vote for him, but they loved watching him. And John Lindsay's chances of national success as a liberal Republican died in that campaign, eviscerated by Buckley's cool conservative critique. Even his later account in The Unmaking of a Mayor, which I think, by the way, is by far his best book, doesn't explain fully why he entered the race in 1965. In the end, the cause may have been nothing other than his constant desire to do something more. At the time, Buckley was 40 years old, and National Review had been up and running for a decade. With the wipeout of Barry Goldwater the previous fall and Ronald Reagan's election as governor of California still over a year in the future, the way forward for the conservative movement was not at all clear. He seemed to want some new project to add to his already overfull life, and his performance during the campaign was a revelation. It set up the next great performance as the host of the televised interview program Firing Line, which began in 1966. He wasn't always cool and collected. In a famous exchange on national television in 1968, he threatened to sock Gore Vidal, and you'll stay plastered, he told him, for calling him a crypto-Nazi. But the effect of Buckley's star power was to give a cool look to conservatism and form the modern image of an intellectual movement. Think of all that he managed to do. He had a rich man's existence with the skiing in Switzerland and the sailing on the Atlantic and the parties on Park Avenue and the chauffeur-driven car coming into Manhattan from the estate in Connecticut. And then he had his writing life, creating the series of spy thriller novels that began in 1976 with Saving the Queen, and then he wrote books about food, and he wrote books about boating, and he wrote a book about his depressing time at the United Nations, and he wrote books about nearly everything under the sun. All the while, he had his pundit's career, writing 3 newspaper columns a week, and taping his television show, and editing National Review, and giving 70 lectures a day, and plotting political adventures with the powers that be, and on and on it went. It was enough to fill 3 lifetimes. And yet somehow, in the recent accounts of all of this, his Christian devotion seems almost to have disappeared. This was yet another of the simultaneous lives that he led, another string to his bow, and there was a time in the 1950s and 1960s when William F. Buckley was routinely seen as the nation's leading Catholic layman. His parents' Catholicism formed their children more significantly than anything else, and the family's experience rescuing priests during the anti-clerical Mexican Revolution helped define for Bill Buckley and his siblings their vision of themselves as radically opposed to the modern pattern of the world. It seemed perfectly in character when, at a talk at Catholic University in 1971, his sister, Patricia, responded to the suggestion that the Virgin Mary might have aborted the infant Jesus by storming the stage and slapping at the speaker, Tigrace Atkinson. Buckley himself was never a professional Catholic, in the sense of someone who made his living from the fact of his faith. And his standing, excuse me, his standing as a Catholic commentator may have declined a little bit when in 1961, National Review famously responded to John XXIII's encyclical on Christianity and social progress, Mater e Magistra, by quoting the quip, Mater si, Magistra no. Still, it was always there in his life, even if on firing line, curiously, he most often used Malcolm Muggeridge as the designated Christian commentator. Buckley could joke about his faith. He said of the deathbed conversion to Catholicism of his friend Frank Mayer that the only remaining obstacle to his conversion was the collectivist implication lurking in the formula, the communion of saints. At the same time, he could be serious about his faith. In reply to Gary Will's claim that being Catholic always mattered to him more than being conservative, Buckley responded, if he meant he has a higher loyalty to God than to civil society, then the answer is obvious. God is preeminent. But he never let it go, even in his final months, darkened by the death of his wife in April of 2007. In the 1950s, here's a curious little fact I haven't seen exposed enough. In the 1950s, William F. Buckley made an attempt to purchase the Catholic magazine Commonweal through the agency of the theorist James Burnham, whose brother Philip had been editor of Commonweal. Those were different days, of course, in the glow of a Catholic Renaissance that ran from the philosophical work of Jacques Maritain to the fiction of Flannery O'Connor, and Commonweal was a significant intellectual publication in those days. It would have been fascinating to observe what, in an alternate universe, William F. Buckley might have done as editor of a Catholic intellectual journal instead of National Review. At the time of his death, the obituaries in the New York Times, for example, in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, they nearly all reduced his Catholicism to nothing more than a species, or at best a cause, of his political conservatism. This diminishment of his religious mind to political activism marks a loss, I think, in our understanding of how an intellectual life is made and how a full life is lived. The word full certainly describes William F. Buckley's life. With everything he did, he was always doing something more. With everything he was always being something more, leading some further life, accomplishing some further goal, learning some further skill. He found fame young, and the truth we have to admit is that he sought that fame pretty hard. But he was never just a famous man any more than he was just a well-known political pundit or a television celebrity. And it was, more than anything else, his faith that gave him the more that defined him, a place to stand outside himself, a power to laugh, and a higher life to live. Perhaps the key to that more, however, is to think of William F. Buckley as a writer. He wrote, after all, more than 50 books, more than 800 editorials, articles, and remarks in National Review, hundreds of articles in other magazines, and almost 6,000 syndicated newspaper columns. For that matter, as George Nash has suggested, he may well have composed more personal letters than any American who has ever lived. It's also worth noticing that it all began with a book that had the word God in the title. Written when he was barely 25 years old, his first book, God and Man at Yale, has been in print for almost 60 years. Buckley entered Yale as an undergraduate after the war in 1946 and quickly became a campus success on the debate team. He was editor of the Yale Daily News. He was a member of Skull and Bones. His senior year, the school invited him to be the undergraduate speaker at the university's annual Alumni Day ceremonies. And that's when it all started to go south. Much of my information about this is drawn from the great historian of conservatism, George Nash. In Nash's account, Buckley prepared a speech depicting Yale as a university that had lost its moorings and its mission. It was time, he argued, for Yale's trustees to define their institution's purpose and to take measures to imbue her students with that same purpose. Well, when Yale's administration saw an advance copy of Buckley's text, they were horrified. They first asked Buckley to revise his draft, and then, the day before the event, they asked him to withdraw from the program. In Buckley's later description, Yale's suppression of his Alumni Day address was the catalyst for what happened next. Shortly after his graduation in 1950, he embarked on a systematic book-length study of education at Yale. In the foreword, he declared the point of it all. "I myself believe," he wrote, "that the duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. I further believe that the struggle between individualism and collectivism is the same struggle reproduced on another level. I believe that if and when the menace of communism is gone, other vital battles at present subordinated will emerge to the foreground, and the winner must have help from the classroom." He had gone to Yale, he said, looking for allies against secularism and collectivism. Instead, he found the net impact of Yale's education to be distinctly anti-Christian and anti-individual. Even Yale's religion department was neither a source of pervasive Christian influence nor indeed of any influence, he said, upon the undergraduates. He charged that some of Yale's most popular professors, whom, by the way, he named, were hostile to Christianity even in the classroom. There was a Christian presence at Yale, admittedly, he said, but it was all in extracurricular activities and all of a kind of non-doctrinal works righteousness do-gooder type, which he said is no substitute for classroom exposition and guidance. The educational institutions of the West are the nerve center of civilization, but the guardians of the sustaining core of civilization have, he said, abdicated their responsibility to mankind. There was something both very charming and very pretentious about that prose in the mouth of a new graduate from Yale, but he made it work. God and Man at Yale was published in 1951 by Henry Regnery, and in the first 6 months, the volume went through 5 printings and sold 25,000 copies, which is an amazing feat for an unknown author on a college topic. Part of the cause came from the notice it received. Time and Life and Newsweek and the Saturday Review all gave it reviews. Then, too, there was the money Buckley's father gave him, $16,000 to use for publicity on that book, which is about $100,000 in today's terms. But in truth, what the money bought was notice of what these magazines would have covered anyway, because it was a great story. Here was a brilliant young graduate of Yale, a member of Skull and Bones, attacking his school for straying from true religion and the American way. Life magazine compared him to, quote, the brat who comes to the party and tells the guests that their birthday boy is secretly a dope addict. It wasn't all good publicity, of course. Yale immediately swung into full reaction mode. In The Atlantic, Yale graduate and Harvard University professor McGeorge Bundy said the book was, quote, dishonest in its use of facts, false in its theory, and a discredit to its author. And he went on to call Buckley a twisted and ignorant young man whose personal views of economics would seem reactionary to Mark Hanna. Yale promptly ordered 2,000 reprints of Bundy's review, which it handed out to alumni. In the Yale Daily News, the Yale professor of religion, Theodore Green, who had been one of Buckley's targets in the book, called the book pure fascism. The New Republic accused Buckley of advocating the methods used by the Stalinists. Others compared him to Torquemada, Savonarola, and Joseph Goebbels. In The Progressive, which was an important magazine in those days, a Yale law professor said the book was merely a barbarian bleat by one bigoted boy. And the Saturday Review mildly opined, this book is one which has the glow of a fiery cross on a hillside at night. There will undoubtedly be robed figures who gather to it, but the robes will not be academic. They will cover the face. The metaphors in all of this are extraordinary when you stop to think about it. fascism, Stalinism, the Inquisition, the Ku Klux Klan. But one of the keys that I think has been insufficiently remarked was Buckley's Catholicism. McGeorge Bundy insisted it was very strange for an ardent Catholic like Buckley to offer a prescription pretending to speak for Yale's true religious tradition, which was Protestant, of course. It was stranger still, Bundy added, for Buckley to offer no word or hint in his book of William F. Buckley's special allegiance. There were pronounced and well-recognized differences between Protestant and Catholic views on education in America, Bundy insisted, that disqualified William F. Buckley from speaking about Yale. The Saturday Review similarly accused Buckley of concealing his very relevant church affiliation. Henry Sloane Coffin. These were all names to conjure with once upon a time, but they probably mean nothing to anyone who's under 30 years old. Henry Sloane Coffin said Buckley's book was plainly, quote, distorted by his Roman Catholic point of view. Yale, Coffin pointed out, was a Puritan and Protestant institution by its heritage, and Buckley should have attended Fordham or some similar institution. Of course, Buckley received little help from the intellectual Catholic press, but that wasn't because of his Catholicism, that was because of his economics. Both Commonweal and the Pilot charged him with advocating heresy. The typical Catholic commentator on the book rather liked the swipes at Yale, but declared that Buckley's laissez-faire economics was in conflict with the collectivist social teachings of the church. Even Russell Kirk condemned Buckley's individualism as unchristian, asserting that Buckley's remedy would be, quote, worse than the disease. What William F. Buckley learned from all of this was, curiously, how to fight back and how to be a writer. To those who accused him of fascism, he replied that irresponsible, irreproachable education by an academic elite was itself a kind of fascism. What was authoritarian about the ideals that he said he was putting forward of a minimalist state and deference to a transcendent order? And to the fashionable Catholic journals, as he called them, he replied that too many Christian modernists seem to believe that the road to Christianity on earth lies through the federal government. It all ended up making surprisingly little difference to Yale. The school's fundraising actually increased during that tumultuous year. But for Buckley, the difference was enormous. Within weeks of the book's publication, he was a national celebrity. There's a straight line that connects God and Man at Yale to the founding of National Review in 1955. In the words of George Nash, God and Man at Yale set Buckley on the road to becoming arguably the most important public intellectual in American life in the second half of the 20th century. The question, of course, for us is what we're to make of all of this. William F. Buckley probably wrote less about his faith than any other major Catholic figure of the 20th century, at least if we calculate that by sheer percentage of the prose he turned out in his enormously productive lifetime. That distinguishes him from the great apologists, the converts mostly, with which the 20th century began. I'm thinking of Chesterton, for instance. And it distinguishes him from the prolific controversialists late in the century, from Gary Wills to Richard John Newhouse. But if you think about it, Buckley's young and fairly arrogant assumption of his Catholicism was in many ways surprisingly typical of the middle generation to which he belonged. It is not usual to describe William F. Buckley as a central figure in the golden age of what came to be called the Catholic Renaissance, that began just before World War II and ran through to the beginning of Vatican II. I've always somewhat mistrusted that name, the Catholic Renaissance. It always seemed to me that to have a Renaissance, you had to have had a naissance somewhere along the way. And the truth is that this 1940s generation were really the first to put it all together as American Catholic writers. Still, the thing I want you to consider is Buckley's place alongside Merton and Dulles and Lowell and Tate and Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy. I want you to consider him, especially the young Buckley of God and Man at Yale, as exploding on the American scene in much the same way that those other Catholic writers did. I once accused the young convert poet Robert Lowell of espousing Catholicism in the 1940s with all the marital fidelity of a gigolo. He didn't become a Catholic, Robert Lowell didn't become Catholic, for the sake of poetic impulse. He had plenty of his own, and the truth is the modern history of English Catholic poetry, especially in America, was pretty thin on the ground. Neither was Lowell looking really for a topic to write about. For poets in that generation, the world provided plenty of topics. Now, what Robert Lowell needed, and the reason he converted to Catholicism, was a system of thought, a place to write from, a coherent set of symbols, and a powerful collection of truths with which to begin his work. Catholicism was a world to write out from, a place on which to stand and evaluate the world that stood outside. And you get, as a result of his conversions, lines like, remember the end of The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket? You could cut the brackish winds with a knife here in Nantucket, Lowell writes, and cast up the time the Lord God formed man from the sea's slide and breathed into his face the breath of life, and blue-lunged combers lumbered for the kill. The Lord survives the rainbow of his will. Well, you get stuff like that writing out of Catholicism. Now, consider William F. Buckley in this context. For all that it has God in the title, God and Man at Yale is not a particularly religious book, and it's certainly not a book of Catholic apologetics or exegesis. And yet, read in this way that I'm proposing, as a text in the Catholic Renaissance, it resembles Flannery O'Connor's stories and Robert Lowell's poetry and Walker Percy's prose. The writings of William F. Buckley through the 1950s assumed Catholicism. Those writings took it as a place to stand and look outward on the world. They took it as a system of truth by which things could be judged. No one speaks more about their eyeglasses than about the things that they see with those eyeglasses. And William F. Buckley, like much of his confident generation, was far more interested in evaluating what he saw rather than describing the Catholicism that allowed him to see it. A short generation later, and all of that was gone. Gary Wills and Michael Novak make a nice portrait of that next generation, crisscrossing as Wills moved from conservative at National Review to liberal at the New York Review of Books, and Michael Novak from liberal to conservative. But for both of them, Catholicism had become an inward-looking thing. To be a Catholic was, for that generation, to write and think about being a Catholic constantly. For that entire generation, the focus of Catholic intellectual attention was inward on the church, rather than outward from the church to the world. It's funny to think of them this way, of course, since the liberal Catholics of the 1960s thought they were opening the church to the world, which is part of the subversive effort I'm aiming at with this description. But what a book like God and Man at Yale demonstrates, it seems to me, is let me think about it this way. What a book like God and Man at Yale demonstrates, and what a life like William F. Buckley's proves, is just how much you can actually accomplish when Catholics, confident in the intellectual foundations of the church, suddenly turn their attention outward on an unsuspecting world. And that, it seems to me, is what William F. Buckley managed to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bottum. That certainly gives us a great deal to think about. And so now I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments. Come on, sir.
Julie, I couldn't help but notice your own educational affiliation, Boston College, Georgetown, and this battle that was engendered in God and Man at Yale. And here we have two institutions that you were affiliated with, both of which whose Catholic identity is what would appear to have been shredded. So could you comment on the state of higher Catholic education right now?
There you go. Welcome to Portsmouth.
My wife and I both went to Georgetown. We were married in a chapel on campus 2 years after we graduated. One forms an attachment to one's undergraduate school that it takes a lot to damage. Georgetown has certainly been trying. On the other hand, my daughter was in the hospital. She had pneumonia this winter. We had an unbelievably hard winter, funeral after funeral. My daughter was in the hospital for 10 days with pneumonia. And the Georgetown University basketball team sent her up a huge box of stuffed toys and signed postcards and so on. And my wife said, they keep doing this. Just when we think we've broken free, they still you know, this, it seems to me, is the fundamental question that we're going to face over the next 10 years. This is now a very inter-Catholic discussion. If we want to have it, it seems to me it looks like this. Over the next 10 years, the relation of the old Catholic institutions to the Church is going to arise again and again and again. And the question is whether or not we have to walk the path that the Protestant churches walked with their own institutions, their hospitals, their colleges, their high schools, and all the rest of it. I don't know what the answer is. I think Notre Dame, the situation in Notre Dame this spring brought all of this to a head, or at least forced it into view, even if we don't have a solution to it yet. The key book on all this is, of course, Jim Burchell's Dying of the Light, which is a set of case studies of one college after another, Protestant schools mostly. And what Jim argues is that Catholic schools are merely 50 years behind the Protestant schools. That it was already too late when William F. Buckley complained about Yale. You remember one of Yale's first responses was to appoint a committee when they heard about the book to investigate the religious situation of Yale. And the committee reported that it was perfectly obvious to anyone with eyes that Yale was a Christian school. Here we are, 60 years later, you can't imagine that response. You can't imagine it coming from a school like Yale. I think it's quite revealing. Now the question is, you know, are we going to take the somewhat pessimistic line of Jim Burchell, which is Catholic schools are basically just 50 years behind. We are living at Notre Dame right now, the fight that William F. Buckley was living at Yale. Is that the metaphor we want? Is that what we think is true? I'm not sure. I hope not. And in fact, I'm not that pessimistic. It seems to me, though, that the bishops have to be willing to deploy the tools that they have. One of the problems is that the bishops basically have no instrument between the pinprick of an unhappy letter and the atom bomb of saying you must stop calling yourselves Catholic. And they have no weapon between to deploy against schools that are doing this. But in 10 years, if the pattern continues, I mean, Notre Dame would be ruined if the bishops announced that it could no longer call itself a Catholic school and the sacraments could no longer be performed on campus. Notre Dame would be, the alumni would rebel, Notre Dame would be ruined by that. Georgetown would be hurt by it, hurt bad, but might survive. In 10 years, it is possible that Notre Dame will be where Georgetown is now, and Georgetown will sneer at the threat. And that's the question you have to face. It seems to me that the weapon that the bishops have, this atom bomb, has to be deployed at some point to bring people into line. On the other hand, here's some more optimistic thoughts. A friend of mine is a professor at a Jesuit school in the Midwest, where he's the star on campus. You know, the one who's editing all the series and writing all the books and so on. And he met the president one day. They were walking over to meet some funders, and after the Notre Dame stuff, and the president said to him, I don't want any of this on my campus. Now the president is a good man, but you know, with the spaghetti spinal cord of most of these guys, you know, he's not looking for a fight. So what's his answer? His answer is the lesson he took from Notre Dame, from the debates about Notre Dame, was not Notre Dame got away with it. The lesson was who needs the aggravation. Right? It seems to me that if those of us who feel that the sense of the faithful in the United States has come together to be scandalized when Catholic institutions honor those whose public stance on abortion scandalize us. If those of us who understand Catholicism or the Catholic culture in America in this way, that this has now become perfectly clear, it seems to me the people we want to influence are the cowards, right? I mean, it's the kind of wimpy, get along guys that we want to influence, because they're the ones now who think, and this would be the good news, if they took from Notre Dame the lesson that you're going to get protesters, it's going to be aggravation, the publicity is going to be bad, you're going to have to answer 50 letters from influential alumni who give you money and it's just not worth it, that's great news from Notre Dame, right? If the news from Notre Dame instead is Notre Dame got away with it and the bishops actually have no power, then that's bad news. I don't know which way it's going to break, but it seems to me we have to keep pushing on exactly this issue, or the Catholic institutions will be lost to the church in exactly the way that Yale was lost, as William F. Buckley describes it.
Thank you. Sir?
Who would you say is the heir to the Bill Buckley Catholic conservative movement? Is there someone that has come from the Ivy League, someone younger, someone who can carry on that same mantra of faith plus, conservative political values? Because as someone who has been in Catholic school my whole life, I'm hard pressed to find anyone of that strong a voice from a Catholic circle.
Yeah, I think you want to be careful speaking about heirs here. Each generation manages to produce its wonderful people and its great writers, but they're very rarely in some straight line of succession. It's always kind of a surprise, as imagine poor Yale. I mean, William F. Buckley was a surprise to them, right? And it's always going to be like that. I mean, the giants that we have lost in the last year have been. I'm very close with the editor of the Weekly Standard, Bill Crystal. Right? I saw him down at Jack Kemp's funeral. The last time I had seen him was at Richard John Newhouse's funeral. And I thought, this is not really what I want to be doing with, seeing my friends. Let's all get together while we're at so-and-so's funeral. This is, but we're going to see the loss of a lot of these figures who have identified Catholicism or American public life in the conservative movement. And we're going to be burying him over the next 10 years. This was, well, I'll tell you one little story that I mentioned to someone else. I was leaving the house in the end of February, and we homeschooled. My daughter was sitting on the couch looking sad, and I asked her what was wrong. She said, both the priests on your best in all the world have died. Is this going to keep happening? And I thought, well, this is a measure of how hard these losses of the last year have been on my family, not just professionally. I thought, there are two answers to this, neither of which I'm actually going to make to a 10-year-old girl. One is yes. Right? The other is count yourself lucky, kid. It's not every little Catholic schoolgirl who has Richard John Newhouse and Avery Dulles as the two priests that she's closest to. There's no succession like this, that just sort of hands-on. And these men, precisely because when we look at these people, they're irreplaceable. Right. There is no William F. Buckley III in this context, right? There's no replacement for Avery Dulles. But you see, every generation produces people, the faith goes on, and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. The public life argument goes on. Robbie George, it seems to me, has assumed, every year seems to me, to assume a bigger place, which I've always liked Robbie, but it still kind of surprises me to watch it happen. Young Ross Douthat out of Harvard is another. One of the things to think about is this I'll put briefly an argument I've made over and over again. Probably shouldn't make it here, because it's an argument about homeschooling. But it seems to me that if you talk to the parents who are homeschooling and ask them why they're doing it and how they're doing it, the language that they use will have very little to do with education and a whole lot to do with culture, right? And that as the traditional devices for the passing on of Catholic culture, not Catholic faith here, but Catholic culture, right, declined. People don't, the old Catholic ethnic neighborhoods are all gone everywhere. They're wiped out. The best Catholics I know among young people have absolutely no sense of geographical parish. Right? They think absolutely nothing of not going to the church in their neighborhood, but getting in their car and driving 40 minutes because, you know, over at St. Francis, they do a really good mass. You know what I'm talking about? I went out to Denver and I said this and everybody applauded, like this was a great thing, right? And then I said, including Archbishop Chaput, and I said, you know, they also think that they have no natural relation to the diocese that they fall in. I've got young people in my office who think their real bishop is Archbishop Chaput, right? Not Cardinal Egan or, you know, I mean, the idea that you can pick and choose your parish, you can pick and choose your diocese, you can pick and choose all of this kind of outside Catholicism or cultural Catholicism means that the culture is decayed, the whole Catholic culture. Homeschooling seems to be functioning in a very weird and probably ultimately failed way to provide culture again. And that's the way the parents speak about it. Somebody is going to come, though, out of these homeschooled movements, because whenever you get a small group like this inbred, right, when they do finally come back, you know, they explode and take over the world. You know, here's an example. First 2.5 decades of the 20th century, the Protestant churches in America, the mainline Protestant churches, creamed off for maybe a generation and a half the absolute best and brightest and most serious of their young people and sent them off as missionaries to the Far East. The great missionary movements of this time are extraordinary, and it was always the best kids, right? The ones who were good at languages. I mean, best in the sense that they were the smart ones who were morally and religiously serious, and they were all creamed off by the Presbyterians and the Methodists and one after another, and they were all sent off, and their kids came back and took over the world. As late as the 1970s in this country, the #1 shared characteristic among people in who's who was childhood missionaries to the Far East. Because they sent them out there, all these kids, and they all married each other, and you know, then their kids came out of that culture and were ready to explode. I hope, and I think that out of some of the nascent Catholic movements now, homeschooling, the very serious schools that have, like Portsmouth Abbey, that have set themselves against a kind of dominant going with the culture. Out of those worlds, I think we'll see explosion, because it's the best and the brightest. You know, that, by the way, is an actually negative phrase, but it's the kids who are intellectually serious. No, let me think of an even better phrasing. The kids who are morally serious about the intellectual life, right? For whom the things that go on in the mind are not merely to be clever, they also are morally significant. If you've ever been a teacher, you know the people I'm talking about, the young people I'm talking about for whom that works, right? They're the ones, it seems to me, who are all, if any of them that you met over the last 10 years, have either just converted to Catholicism or they're flirting with converting with Catholicism, and it's out of that movement, it seems to me, that we have actually great hope.
Yes, sir. This may be a bit of a bomb, but you mentioned Cardinal Egan. I was disturbed and wrote what I hope was a nice letter asking how it is that such a prominent representative of the Catholic Church could be in all the papers glad-handing the new president, who is the greatest foe of life so far. How do we look at that as Catholics? Do we be pragmatic and say he's got to be in the political mix? I mean, you know, would William F. Buckley have glad-handed Obama, you know?
I think you want to be careful. First of all, we have a new Archbishop in New York, but I have a duty and a reverence that's owed to the old one, and I don't want to name particular people in this context. But I will say this, because saving his reverence. I will say this. This consensus that I described earlier about the faithful and abortion in the United States is relatively new, and we're still working out the details of it. I knew, and everybody knew, that the fight between the Catholic bishops and the Catholic faithful and the Catholic on one hand, the Catholic institutions on the other was coming. I didn't want this fight to be, and I don't think anybody with any seriousness wanted this fight to be about a visit of the President of the United States, right? Okay, we all knew the fight was coming. You don't get to pick where the fights are going to happen, and this is where it happened. Given my druthers, would I have fought it over a visit of the President of the United States? No. The answer is no. I didn't want that. There were better places to fight it, right? But this is where it came out, right? So, and that's what we had to do. This is a new consensus, it seems to me, and it took Notre Dame by surprise, right? Father Jenkins did not expect this. He didn't see it coming at all. And it's only going to get stronger because the sense of the faithful, it seems to me, has solidified on this. Now, that's only in this country. Right? Cardinal Schönbrunn, right, who's about as orthodox as it gets. Remember, Cardinal Schönbrunn was the editor of the Catechism, right? Was photographed just last week, last month, shaking hands and embracing pro-abort politicians in Austria. Right? And nobody blinks. Right? Now, one understands that he would like to persuade them and all the rest of it. I mean, no, I'm not going to accuse the cardinal of being a pro-abort, right? But it's on the table in the United States in a way that it's not in Europe. Right? We need to bring them around. And in the United States here, I think some of the bishops used to, and lots of the Catholic figures of the world used to think that, you could oppose abortion and be serious about opposing abortion and still kind of go along with the general cultural and political drift. It seems to me that's changing, and it's changing as Catholicism becomes more and more anti-cultural, or I suppose as the culture becomes more and more anti-Catholic would probably be the way to put it. I think, regardless of what you think about homosexual behavior and same-sex marriage, as this happens increasingly over the next few years, we're going to see real challenges to freedom of religion for Catholicism, and we're going to see real challenges to freedom of conscience over all of this. I will here go out on a limb and say within 5 years, one of the New England states that has recently allowed same-sex marriage, one of the New England states will remove powers to perform civil marriages from clergy in churches that do not allow same-sex marriage. And I'm predicting that within 5 years. Within 5 years, Massachusetts or one of those states will say Greek Orthodox, Catholic, Mormon, Islamic. If you're a clergyman, there's as a courtesy, you're allowed to get this license essentially, and it's a form of being a justice of the peace, right? And you can issue the marriage license that's civilly binding as well as religiously binding. Within 5 years, we'll see a state pass a law that removes that power from anybody who's a clergyman in a church that doesn't allow same-sex marriage. And think, marriage is, as Maggie Gallagher told us, one of the key places, right, where the public square is clothed. People want religious weddings, right? This is, in America, this is one of the key links of it all. And we're going to see that go away, it seems to me, within a few years.
Was that a constitutional one?
In the back there?
Yes, I'd like to ask a follow-on question to your first question about the Catholic schools and your loyalty to Georgetown undergraduate. In my circles, we're having a raging debate among people of my age group who were at Georgetown, Villanova, Holy Cross, etc. And basically, most of us say we have to have a strategy that, quote, takes back these Catholic institutions. But in the minority, we have a group saying that's going to be an impossibility. So what we have to do is sever our undergraduate ties and look for the small Catholic colleges like Thomas More in New Hampshire and opt to sending our grandchildren to those small Catholic colleges and just letting the big name colleges be secular. Could you care to comment on that debate?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of pieces here, that you want to move around on the table as you're looking, to try and put this jigsaw puzzle together. One is that the experience of American Catholics has been an experience of building rival institutions over our history, right? And the American Catholic institutions were built primarily in this country not with wealth. The great Jewish synagogues and the great Jewish schools, great Jewish institutions in this country were built by the rich. The Catholic institutions in this country were built by the widow's mite. They were built by Irish scrub women on their knees during the day, dropping nickels into the collection, and which makes them, the loss of them, it seems to me, all the more painful as they drift away. But are they going to drift away? It seems to me that the pessimistic crowd that says cut your losses, right? Go with these startup schools, go with these new institutions. They're ignoring several things. One is the huge cultural and financial investment that we have in the bricks and mortar that those washerwomen built for us and that we've inherited. The second thing that seems to me they're ignoring is our experience for the last 50 years has not been of having rival institutions because the Catholic institutions have become mainstream. I remember, back in the 70s, reading about the 1970s, Philadelphia threatened to tax church property because they were going, remember this is back when cities were almost bankrupt. It never happens again, of course, anymore. But Philadelphia threatened to tax church property, and the Archbishop of Philadelphia said that if they did, he would close the Catholic schools. At that point, the Catholic schools of Philadelphia were educating 40% of students in Philadelphia, and of course they would have cost the city more than it would have gotten on taxes to educate them all. The Catholic schools and the Catholic hospitals have not been rival institutions, outside institutions for a long time, and our experience has been of that. The third thing it seems to me that your friends, the more pessimistic of your friends, want to consider is what guarantee do they have that the institutions which are founded now as outside institutions and rival institutions and parallel institutions won't themselves in their time follow the same path? If we do not find a way off this path, all you've done, it seems to me, by founding a rival institution is jump back 50 years on the path. Right? We need to find a different path for our institutions and that preserves their Catholicism, that understands that Catholicism culturally and philosophically is both not of this world and of this world, right? That our understanding of marriage is an assertion not just about what Catholics believe, but what is true for human beings. That our assertions about metaphysics and the fundamental truths of natural law are not merely assertions like eating fish on Friday, which are binding solely on Catholics. They are claims about truth in the world itself. And our institutions are not merely institutions for Catholics or of Catholicism. They are institutions for the truth and the power and the right governance of the world itself. And until we find a path that lets us preserve these institutions in that way, it seems to me the rival institutions, much as I like them, I like them a lot, but they don't solve the problem. They merely attempts to jump back and keep us on the same path.
Santo Genitore, Deo Prius Apostolius,